Would you join me in turning to Colossians chapter 1? The next couple of weeks, we're going to put a pause on our Acts study because I want to consider together the reality of what we celebrate at Christmas time, which, remember, is not just the event that we hear about, read about, sing about, of what happened in Bethlehem almost 2,000 years ago. Actually, more than 2,000 years ago. That night and the events around Jesus' birth, that's not the main thing that we meditate on. The facts of the matter must be considered, must be believed, and must be embraced. But it's the meaning of the facts that are at the heart of the gospel. Agreed? What does it mean? What was the point? The why of it all? And one of the reasons I say that is that when I look through the New Testament, outside of the two texts that actually deal with the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem and the surrounding events, and that's Matthew and that's Luke. That's it. Matthew and Luke are the only places in our whole Bible that deal with the events surrounding Jesus' birth. But what the New Testament is full of is the reason, the why, the implications, and the woe of its results. And that's what we want to consider today. God willing, next week we'll go back and look at the event itself. But what we see here in Colossians chapter 1 is one of those places where Paul the apostle, who believed that Jesus came in the flesh, descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, descended from Judah, descended from David. Why does that matter? And so we're going to be reading together in Colossians chapter 1, and I'll be reading verses 15 to 23. See if you can pick out any of the language Paul uses that deals with this idea of Jesus being in actual human flesh and blood. Before we read and study, though, I need to pray. Do you need to pray? Yeah, we do. Let's go to the Father. Let's ask his help. Father, we love coming to you. We don't do it lightly. We don't do it flippantly. We come being reminded of who you are, seated at the center of all of reality, knowing that at your right hand is your exalted and glorified Son, our Master Jesus. We come asking you, Father, very sincerely, that you will give us the gift of understanding, of insight, of revelation, because your word is true. It is power. It is more important to us than our daily bread. We want life, Lord, life with you and life in your kingdom, life together, and we know that your word brings life. So we ask this in Jesus' name. If you agree, you say, Amen. Verse 15, Colossians 1, verse 15. The Son is the image of the invisible God. Do you see anything yet? Do you see it? That Jesus was born as a human being in real flesh and blood is the basis of Paul's statement right there. Jesus, the Son, he is what it actually says. The NIV is putting in the noun there instead of the pronoun to remind us what he's been talking about. But he, the Son, Jesus, is the image, the visible image of the invisible God. Whoo! I hope we haven't gotten too used to that statement that it doesn't smack you in the face. That ought to smack us in the face. The God that you cannot see can now be seen in his Son, the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And by firstborn there, we do not mean the first one created. We mean the ranking one, the one of the firstborn privilege. That's a very ancient idea we don't have so much in our culture, so I just want to point that out. This isn't about, he was born before anything else was born in creation. No, he was born pretty far into the story, wouldn't you say? The fact that he has ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, he's pretty far into the story of humanity when he's born in Bethlehem. That's not the issue. he has the rank and the privilege of firstborn over everything. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. Now you're saying, now hold on, we seem to have a slight inconsistency. Because if Jesus truly was born that far into the story in Bethlehem, how is it that he's before all things and through whom all things exist? And what is the answer the disciple of Jesus offers? If he was born that far into the story of creation, how is it that he is the source of creation? Did he not exist before he was conceived in the womb of Mary? Was he not, as John 1 talks about, the Word? And when was the Word, according to John? In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. Ooh, man, I hope that still slaps you in the face too. That's just some crazy stuff we're talking about here. Honest to goodness, if I knew nothing about this and you just came up to me and started telling me this stuff, I'd be like, what kind of superhero comic books are you talking about? This is wild and wacky. Yeah, but it's true. It's even better because it's true. Verse 17. He is before all things, and in him, do you see what it says there? All things hold together. He's like the glue that holds it all together. Woo! He is the head of the body, the church. Now, we're going to have to think on that at some point. He was born into a human body, conceived in the womb of a virgin, born in Bethlehem with a human body, and he ascends back to the Father, and then the Father gives him an earthly body to remain behind. He's got an actual literal body as he sits beside the Father, but he's also got an actual literal body still on earth called the church. Oh my goodness. He's the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead. The first one ever to be resurrected, immortal and glorious. Come on, that's fantastic. So that in everything he might have the what? It seems like it calls for way more oomph than that, everybody. Why is it? So that in everything he might have the... Oh, we're getting a little too used to this stuff, I think. This is a little too old hat for us. Listen, okay, come on. You know what supremacy means, right? Supreme above all things is the man Jesus that has called to you as a part of a larger people he's called to himself. And he has sworn to you in the covenantal process of your baptism. He swore to you that he will shepherd you. And you swore to him that you would follow. Now, if the person who has supremacy over everything in existence has sworn to shepherd you, does that not change everything? Because look, you and I both know this world is messed up, and people around me are messed up. And oh, don't forget, I am messed up. And things are out of my control that are super important, that have huge implications and ramifications in my life. And left to myself, who, by the way, am not supreme over really anything, left to myself, I am scared, I am helpless, I am tossed back and forth by the circumstances of my life because I can't control it. Anybody tracking with me? And then you come to this reality that is a rock solid anchor, and you find out that the one who has vowed to shepherd you has supremacy over all of it. Oh my goodness. I'm just saying this should be a little bit exciting. I mean, this ought to be kind of a big deal for us, right? Okay. Not only does it have to be a big deal to us, we have to remind the world that this stuff is true. Because look, supremacy, if you were to ask the world who's supreme over all things, they're not going to think of Jesus. We need to show them how supreme he is. Okay, look at verse 19. This statement right here ought to be another indicator of what we're talking about this morning. Why is he supreme over everything? Why is all that other stuff true? For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, meaning the Son. The fullness of God's nature, power, authority, all of that. It made God happy, okay? God was delighted to pour all of that into a bodily form. My goodness. And through him, the Son, God was very happy, very pleased to do what? Now, come on, we got to get Twitter-pated by this right here. And through him to reconcile to himself, the Father now. The Father's reconciling to himself, which means that relationship has been broken, harmony has been destroyed, right? He has gladly, in his Son Jesus, in whom all his fullness dwells, he has gladly chosen to reconcile to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his, what do you see? Blood shed on the cross. Do you not see an indication as to why the enfleshment of Jesus is a big deal? Because the peace was made not with words, which you don't need a body to speak words. We know that. God has spoken many times without a body being around. But the peace wasn't accomplished with words. The peace was accomplished with blood. And someone needed to have blood to offer as that peacemaking. And it was God's own Son, in whom all the fullness of God dwelled. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. I just need to pause there because I'm in this boat. Not everyone is. But in case you are, I need to say this. If you've been a good Christian person, and I put all that in quotes, of course, but if you've been a good Christian boy or girl for so long, you've been in church, you've been very decent and better than most kind of thing, and you're kind of aware of that, and you're just good folk, right? You've been that way for so long that you actually have forgotten how wretched you have been, how far from God you have strayed, how unrighteous you have proven yourself to be. Because you can be very unrighteous in your decency, you know. If you have forgotten that, please go back to verse 21 and don't just, oh yes, that's the way human beings have been. Remember, he said once you, speaking to the disciples in Colossae, you used to be that. Don't miss that. He mentions it for a reason. You cannot savor and relish and give full praise to God for his reconciling actions through the man Jesus, unless you are fully aware that once I needed reconciling so desperately because I was so far from God. So please don't forget that. I'm prone to be honest with you. I've been in the wheelhouse of the church and of religion for so long. I'm like, hey, Jesus has always loved me, and he's always been with me, and he died on the cross for me, all that. I've known it for so long. And Paul, I sense him right here saying, But where were you? He said, oh yeah, I was alienated, which is horrible. But now, see, without verse 21, verse 22 falls flat. But if you got number 21, look at what 22 says to you. But now, he has reconciled you by Christ what? So blood bought peace. His physical body brings reconciliation. Are you seeing why that birth in Bethlehem is a really big deal? Beyond the romance of that lovely night and the songs we sing that are very, very soft and beautiful and romantic. Besides the fact, and we've talked about this before, there's a lot of brutality in that story too, isn't there? It's not all romance and cuteness, right? That story is actually pretty hard in a lot of its elements. But here's the issue, and this is what the scriptures speak to so clearly. The body and the blood, this is not all there is to it. We're going to see some more to it. But at the heart of it, without the body and the blood, the purposes of God to reconcile a fallen rebellion people back to himself, and not just Israelites, but all the nations that, by the way, belonged to a whole lot of other gods. The great work of God to bring his human family that had discarded him so treacherously, it required body and blood. And when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the body that God had prepared for him entered into the world. And it would be over 30 years before that body would be offered on a tree, a cursed tree, mind you, a humiliating, shameful tree, publicly exposed. That body, by the way, that God prepared for him was on display. You know that, right? Like a big part of Roman crucifixion was absolute, devastating shame. And so you would strip the person down. Like, you don't give them any sense of decency up there. That's the point. You know, by the way, I was just listening to a history of some of the Roman things that went on. The Romans did this on purpose. They chose very public, often traveled roadsides to put the crucified people because the point was very much psychological. Look upon the enemy of Rome and see what happens. And of course they're going to put it on a public thoroughfare because if you put it on the back roads, no one's going to see it. No one's going to get the message. Jesus, in this body and blood that God had prepared for him, is hoisted up very publicly along the side of a major thoroughfare. And it's in that body and blood, shamed and degraded and spoken of as dirt and worm and nothingness. It's in that body and blood, so easily and so vulnerable to that kind of attack that God would accomplish something unthinkably good. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through what? Okay, see, this is important. Because the reason, we're going to talk about it, but the reason he had to be an actual human, not just appear in a body, which he did quite often in the Old Testament. God appeared in bodily form, throughout the Old Testament. Something had to be different, though, this time. He had to actually enter humanity in a permanent way so that he's not just, on Tuesday he came in bodily form, and then Wednesday he was gone again. And then next Saturday he showed up in a bodily form, and then he was gone again. No. He had to remain. Why? Because God's showing up in a body, like he did to Abraham. Do you remember that story? 3 visitors come, and Abraham welcomes them like any good, righteous person would do. He welcomes them to feed them and take care of them because they're travelers passing through. And as he talks to the 3, he comes to realize something really profound. The one in the middle is Yahweh himself. Wait, what? He's bringing food to feed Yahweh in a body? What's going on here? And who are the other 2? Do you remember? His angelic company. Yahweh himself, in a body, showed up with 2 angels in bodies and had a chat at Abraham's fireside. And food was offered up, and it was just like talking to 3 folks. It took him a second. It took him a little while to figure out, I'm speaking to Yahweh, the creator of the universe. Why? Because he's in a body. See, why couldn't God just do that in the first century? Because that bodily appearance of Yahweh cannot die. And look how it happens. But he reconciles you by Christ's physical body through death. That means he had to be mortal. Agreed? Mortal by definition means you can die. To present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. There is an if here. Please do not miss the if. There is a conditional statement here. Because I think we all are clear on this. I hope so. The statements Paul is making here does not apply to every single person, right? So what's the if? If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. At the heart of the message of the gospel that Paul and all the other apostles and the church ever since has been trying to bring to the world with a sense of how true it is. Not just another voice in the myriad voices you'll hear all the time. No, but the message, the one that matters more than anything. It centers around the enfleshment of the living God in his son Jesus. Now, that phrase that I have in the title of our message does not come from our text, which may seem strange, but it does come from the very next chapter. Let me find it here. Where did oh my goodness, I've lost it. Where did you go, you silly thing? Look at chapter 2, verse 9. There's so much to unpack here. Oof. But Paul keeps really continuing his theme here. And in chapter 2, verse 9, Paul writes, "For in Christ all the fullness of the deity lives in" what? That's crazy to me. Not the majority of the deity. Not the most important elements of deity. The fullness of deity lives in bodily form in a man named Jesus, who is the Christ, the Messiah. So the question is, why? Why did he have to be embodied and enfleshed? What's the big deal? I've already mentioned a little bit of that. We're going to look at it together. I'm going to have to go a little bit quickly here. But you see that phrase at the top of the screen there? That comes from a carol, a Christmas carol. Anybody remember what it is? Hail the incarnate deity. We might sing it tonight, actually. Which is it? Hark the herald angels sing. Charles Wesley. What a phrase. All hail the incarnate deity. We speak of the incarnation, very common Christian word. I wonder, do you know what it means? Like, where does that come from? Well, it traces back to Latin, of course, a lot of Latin things because of the domination of the Roman language there in Christian history. But if you look at the middle of the word carn, and you think of some of the Latin languages, like in Spanish, carne asada, it's weird to connect to what we're talking about. But there it is, it's real. Carne asada, carne means meat. By the way, carne asada is a really delicious form of meat. Anywho, when you think of carne or carne in the Latin roots, that means flesh, meat. What does incarnate mean? In flesh, enfleshment. The fullness of the deity enters into flesh. What we're going to find throughout the New Testament, and I just gave you a sampling. Oops, did I miss it? What? I thought I had a different one. Oops. I had a whole other slide with a whole bunch of cool verses on it, and it's just gone. I'm so sorry. So there are other verses. I could speak of Hebrews, I could speak of the Gospels, I could speak of John and Peter's writings and Revelation. And the point is that the purchasing, the redeeming, the saving of humanity hinges on body and blood. Let me just take it, though, if I could, let me just simplify it. Every gathering we have on a Sunday, and very often in special gatherings, on the Tuesday night gatherings of We Are Church, we consistently remember what we call the Lord's Supper, or communion. Now, when Jesus initiated this with his apostles, it was at the Passover meal, correct? And he changed things. He changed the meaning of things, which is really gutsy. I mean, if you're not somebody special, you don't do that, okay? The thing's been around thousands of years. You don't show up and change it. But Jesus was someone kind of special, right? So what did he say? When he hands out the bread, the unleavened bread of the Passover meal, what did he say it now represents? Body. Interesting. When he hands out the cup to be shared among the apostles, what did he say this represents? my blood. The body was broken, the blood poured out for the forgiveness of many. It's the blood of the new covenant. You see, if Jesus came as a phantasm appearing, if it was about the appearance of it, just the visibility of it, that doesn't make any sense. So my girls are in a production. It was Friday, Saturday, and today is the last production of Frozen Junior. I got to see it twice. It's great, and they do a great job. And they both get to wear costumes. So Emma's a hidden person, so she's wearing like earthy tones because she's a hidden person. And then Brenna is Duke Weaseltown, Wesselton. And so she dresses up in what she said is her favorite costume thus far. And everyone loves it because she comes out and she's got this grayed hair and back in a ponytail and this giganto mustache. Okay? Now, for that production, for the time that they're on stage, they're dressed up as this other persona. When it's over, we're lounging around out in the cafeteria area, waiting for them to become themselves again. Now, what if Jesus pulled one of those? He's still himself, but when he's needed, when it's called for, he'll dress up in his human garb and show up and do his thing, and then he'll take off the human garb and get back to being who he is. What would we be missing if that was the approach that God took? Salvation itself is on the line, isn't it? You cannot offer up body and blood that isn't real. If either of them say, I'll give up my costume for you, I would be like, oh, thanks. You're done with the production anyway, so what? But if you give who you actually are to me, that's a big deal. Do you see it? If what he gave you was a fake, pretend thing that he didn't need anyway, so what? The enfleshment of the Son of God means that when he gives flesh and blood, he's giving his actual self. And that's needed, isn't it? If you're going to purchase something as precious and as valuable as the human race. And not just the human race, as Paul told us in chapter 1, but to reconcile him to himself all things, whether things in heaven or on earth, visible or invisible. Are you kidding me? A costume isn't going to do that. But... and I'm going to have to zoom. That clock I don't think is right yet. Okay. So let me show you. Because this is one thing. I've heard this part my whole life. I didn't get it, but I've heard that part. And this puts it a little crudely, but I think it's honest. I wouldn't have put it in these words before, but I think this was at the heart of what I came to understand. The reason Jesus had to be born as a human is so that he could be the meat on the cross. Because we needed that. He, of course, needed to be flesh. He needed to have blood to offer. And that was such a crucial part of his purpose. But what I came to discover, and you're discovering it yourself, I'm sure. Hopefully we're doing it together. There's more. Jesus was more than a body with blood in it. Can we agree on that? And his coming meant more than being a body and blood on a tree. Because if that's all there was to it, he could have done it a lot earlier than 33-ish. He could have been put on the cross at any time after his birth. It would have worked just fine if body and blood was all that was going on here. So I wanted to share with you a few other absolutely crucial. These are not add-ons. These are not, cherries on top. This is crucial to the work of God in reconciling us to himself. Number one, as we saw in Colossians 1, verse 15, we also see it in John 12:45, John 14:9. We see this idea that Jesus is to us the actual visible representation of God himself. And you're like, okay, seems like purchasing us on the cross is a big deal. Why is that so crucial? And here's why. We've talked about this before. But when God created human beings on earth, man and woman, do you remember he created them to be the image of God on earth? That was their gig. Okay? And as a part of that, they were to rule the lower forms of life on earth. That was it. That was why he created them, according to Genesis chapter 1. They were to reproduce so that they could fill the earth. Now, why fill the earth? Because the whole earth needed an image of God. You know? If they have the image of God in the Garden of Eden, what about the creatures on the other side of the planet? The whole world needs the image of God. So he said, I'm starting with you two, procreate, multiply, fill the earth so that the whole earth has an image of me. Ruling the way I would rule. How did that go? How did the image of God program go? It was broken almost immediately. I don't know how many days it took, if it even took a day. But go from chapters 1 and 2 into chapter 3, and there wasn't a huge span of time where the image of God was intact in the human story. You get to Israel. They were supposed to be image of God. With the laws of God, the ways of God, the kingdom of God, they were given so much so that they could image God well in the human world and to the natural world. How did that go? So badly. See, the image of God program is key to the whole story. And so when you get to the truth that Jesus is the Adam, is the Israel that gets it right, finally, you can see why he's the prototypical Adam. He's the prototypical Israel. He's doing things that show I can do what the others weren't able to. I can image God to the world, even in mortal flesh and blood. Which is why I am so saddened when I find out there are actual disciples of Jesus who think to themselves, I cannot become like Jesus because he's Jesus. And talking of becoming like him is just kind of promising wind. Can't do it. When as you come to understand the fullness of God's purposes, it wasn't just to get Jesus flesh and blood on a tree because he really wanted to purchase these wretches of humans. It was so that the full purpose of God for us to image him well can be accomplished at last. So I want to remind you, the image of Jesus, or the image of God in Jesus, is meant to be reproduced in his people. Which is why we're called his body, which is the visible image of a person's spirit. We are supposed to be the visible image on earth of Jesus' person, right? Woo, that's a whole thing of its own, but there it is. Jesus. We're going to look at the other two John passages in just a moment. I also wanted to mention this, and again, you don't need a body to do this, but let's face it, for human beings, it's a pretty helpful thing if you talk to me in a body or some physical way. He came, in Hebrews 1 verse 5 is not right, 2. What do you just note that on whatever, if you're taking notes? It's Hebrews 1:2, sorry. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers at many times and in various ways, and that's true. He even spoke through a donkey. Did you know that? That's weird. But that happened. So he spoke to a false prophet named Balaam through a donkey. God's very creative. He can talk in a lot of different ways. But what the Hebrews writer says is, but in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son. And he's the exact radiance of God's glory. Ooh, it's so good. But these other places tell you that what Jesus spoke when he was on earth in flesh, what Jesus spoke was God's words. When you heard Jesus speak, you're hearing God himself talk to you. And I don't just mean because the fullness of God dwells in him, but because Jesus said it himself multiple times. Everything I'm saying to you, I got that from Father. I'm passing it on to you. Jesus was brilliant, but he did not come up with the message. He passed it along from Father. The third one, this is crucial. Jesus had to take on the human experience by becoming human, not just play acting. I'll give it a shot for a little while, see what it's like. I'm just curious. No, he actually committed to the role, y'all. Like, he's still human. Did you know that? I didn't know that until I was in my mid-20s. Jesus became permanently human. You say, well, why do you think that? Because did God just take his spirit out of the tomb and zoop him back up to heaven to be the spirit he always had been? The whole fact of the resurrection tells me God intended Jesus to stay human. Whoa, talk about committing to the role. What if Emma decided, I'm going to be a hidden person for the rest of my life? Forever, I am going to roll around on the ground wearing earthy tones. What if Brenna stuck permanently a gigantic mustache to her face and wore a Duke's... I am now going to be Duke Wesselton. forever. You can call me Wesselton. No, you don't do that. That's weird. You've got your own life to live. That's just a role you play. Not so with Jesus. He so wanted to have fellowship with the human race, he said, I'll tell you what, I'll permanently become one of you. And he is not ashamed to call us brothers, call us sisters, Hebrews says. What? But what the Hebrews writer points out in chapters 2 and 4 is that in order to become what he was meant to be, which is a faithful and merciful and empathetic high priest, he had to know what it's like to be us. Because if he never experienced humanity, Jesus cannot be the proper high priest to us. This is why it says in Hebrews that God made Jesus perfect through suffering. And if you don't understand what's going on with the high priest thing, that sounds really blasphemous. What do you mean, Jesus was sinful and then once he suffered, he was back to being pristine again? No. When we say perfect, we mean full. How did Jesus need to be made full through suffering? He wasn't fully prepared to play his role as high priest. Without suffering, he doesn't know what it's like to be human. How can he be our proper high priest? Once he suffered, he's fully ready now to be high priest. He can play the part the way he's always meant to be. Wow. Man alive. Okay, so I'm going to end it here. I mean, you've got plenty to chew on anyways. But I want to make sure we go back to this image idea because I don't want you to miss this. Look at what Jesus said in John 14:9. Like, this is a humdinger, y'all. Is this true? Can this be true? Anyone who has seen me. What do you say? Man. If that doesn't clarify what Paul meant when he says, for he is the image of the invisible God. Literally, when you see him, you have seen the Father. You now know what the Father's like. And look at John 12:45. The one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me. Who sent him? Father. So let me end it here, church, because this is a challenge. This is more than just, oh, aren't you glad Jesus did it? Yes, I am. Oh, my goodness, I am. So glad. Oh, there's no hope without this reality of Jesus coming into flesh and blood. But there's a challenge in it, too. And this is something I've had to re-switch the gears. Repentance is what we call that. I've had to go from just applauding Jesus from afar, saying, thank you so much for doing that, to realizing that when he called me to follow him, he called me to join him in it. What this means is I need to learn, I need to train so that I can become the image of God too. And collectively, and I can't do it on my own, collectively we are the body. So collectively we're supposed to be training so that we can become like Master Jesus, so that we can image God well. When you meditate this Christmas season on the incarnation, enfleshment of your Master, remember this. The enfleshment is imaging. And he did it well, perfectly well, so that people who never were able to figure it out before, I mean, you were alienated from God, weren't you? Just like I was. We never could do it before, but now that we belong to the man Jesus, the perfect image of God, he will show us how to do it, how to love, how to be wise, how to be compassionate, how to rule well, which is our calling, always has been. Admire him, applaud him, love him, worship him as the image of the invisible God. And then please add this to your process of worship. Say, Master Jesus, train me, teach me, show me how to do it too. Because without you, I will never be able to. But with your word and your spirit and your body surrounding and filling me, it's what I will become. The image of the invisible God. Can you imagine a world responding to a church that images God like his son Jesus does? Oh, may it be in you and me.